everyone. Welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. I have with me today Anurag Ramdasan, who is a principal at 314 Capital. 314 recently raised a $100 million fund to invest in early stage startups and has previously invested in startups like Open and Jupiter on the neobanking side, Pocket Aces, which is a media entertainment startup, Darwinbox, which is an HR SaaS startup, mobility firm Yulu, and Licious, which of course sells fresh meat online. Hey Anurag, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for having me also. Great to get on a call and just get started discussing stuff.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. So first off, I guess congrats on raising the fund. How do you guys celebrate?
Well, nothing. We all just relaxed over the weekend. That's about it.
How like the times? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go out to celebrate, so
Yeah.
just sit inside and be happy. That's all.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, to begin with, I want to talk about your career itself, right? And you transition from being an engineer to an investor. I'd love to understand, what has changed in that time and, what has remained the same.
So it's a very extreme sort of a career change to make because and I didn't know that going in. I only can say that in hindsight because engineering is more deterministic, more focused, and there are clear ways of doing things, right? And especially computer engineering, you're focused on your laptop, spending 10-15 hours a day, and then whatever time you have talking to the team and planning. Venture capital on the other side is a very people driven business, right? More than anything, you're talking to people, you're interacting. It's a more subjective, more emotionally driven, passion driven kind of a business. So it's an entirely different skill set, and I don't think there is a natural segue that happens that after a point. I mean, from being an engineer to being like from computer engineer to you could be like a software architect or a CTO or something. The VC is just like a whole different tangent. So I think it was interesting, but it also was something that took a lot of effort for me. It was in the years that I did engineering. I think everything you learn about how to deal with stuff, how to be optimal, etc. The way to be optimal in VC is exactly opposite of that, right? So there is a very very steep learning curve, but again, both are highly creative field. Both require a lot of sitting and thinking. So I guess there was that as an overlap, which definitely did help, and that's sort of been the underlying thing that's worked well for me. Um, but I guess there was just always the upside in my opinion was the inclination towards technology, being an engineer. So
Right.
what I realized was initially I assumed that you know because of that I would have a bigger leeway towards technology company. I'll be more inclined there. But what I've also realized is it opened a whole new avenue where if a company is not very technology focused, I still find that interesting because for me, it intuitively makes a lot of sense on how to infuse technology here. I
Right.
don't need an external validation for that, right? I look at a non-tech business and I think, okay, tech can really augment it. So I think that's been the upside, that kind of an insight. But it's still a continuous process. I wouldn't say that I'm that great a engineer or that great a VC. Just trying to figure out how to be good at both at this point.
Right. And what are, let's say, two or three things that one must, guard against or really understand before making the transition, in your opinion?
Well, honestly, I don't know how many engineers are going to transition to VC. I hope many do. But just the way these paths are structured is very different, right? I mean, engineering has become a lot about speed, quick iterations, move things, move fast and break things, those kind of stuff. Um, Whereas in VC, it's a very different thing. You make an investment now, right? The
Mm.
company will have a runway at least for 2 years. So if the company is not able to do next fundraise and actually ends up shutting down, there is a 2-year gap after which you realize, okay, you made a bad decision. right? There is never a quick feedback, so to speak.
Right.
So it's a very different way of looking at things. You're not thinking about a rapid movement. You're thinking about very clear, concise thought process, some conviction, some subjectivity, right? In engineering, it's still more clear. Okay, this piece of technology suits better than that piece of technology. In VC, you have to run by hypothesis, at least in the early stage, more often than not. So being able to make that kind of a mindset shift, being open to a whole new way of looking at your day to day, I think is very, very important.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that brings up an important point, right? Which is that how do you iterate then in that case? I mean, how do you know you're doing a good job? Because as you mentioned, the company itself might have a 2-year runway, and typically funds might last 8 to 10 years or whatever. How do you know you're doing a good job? What are those markers that you look for as a VC?
So there are a couple of ways to look at it, right? I mean, see, in some cases, the companies do take off very early on, in which case um it's very obvious, okay, that this is a success to a certain extent, right? I mean, we've still seen in the ecosystem that a company may raise $50 million and still goes and shuts down, right? So how do you define success in itself is a very, very uh, tough thing. But I think more important is to learn from your mistakes. More important is to see, like, if you make a bet and it very quickly you realize that this is not working out, what went wrong, right? It's equally important to have a lot of faith in the people you work with, right? I mean, that's where to a certain extent, founders focus mostly on the team than anything, because you want to always be involved with the right kind of people. You don't want to be involved with people you inherently cannot trust, or you feel the need to get too involved within that company. So there are these smaller micro steps which are
Mm-hmm.
like small victories. It's not successes. It's just, it's like you don't know what the outcome of the war will be, but if you win one battle at a time, hopefully things are aligning in your favor, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's how you kind of look at it.
Right. So, do you believe investing is an art or a science? I mean, so there's this famous tweet from this guy Startup L Jackson from back in the day. I mean, he says everyone who came sorry, what does he say? Everyone who came before me is a dart throwing monkey,
Mhm.
and everyone who came after me is a spreadsheet jockey. Right.
Mhm.
So, do you believe it tends towards one direction or the other, the art or the science side of things?
Well, I mean, it's like another way to look at that tweet is, if my investments are not working out, it's an art that I'm trying to master. If it's working out, it's a science that I've figured out, right? So, but no, look, it's a bit of both. There is it's not fully art. Obviously, there is some science to it, right?
Right.
Not all investors are just sitting and guessing. There are certain things that really work. I think what happens more often than not is it's very easy to know what's not going to work,
Hmm.
right? But it's not as easy to know what's going to work. So I think
Interesting.
it's that path. I mean, most VCs with some margin of error obviously can tell you, okay, this will not work out, and that's usually how it plays out. Will it work out, and to what extent will it work out? That is always the question. And I think in that domain, how much science can you apply is sort of a driver of how much success you can get.
So this also reminds me of something a boss of mine used to say, right? So we worked in assessments and recruitment earlier, and he used to say, "Look, I mean, I can't agree with you on what is beautiful, but
Mhm.
let's try to agree on what is ugly, right? So what is absolutely not beautiful." So
Yeah.
uh,
I mean,
before we
it's a
move on,
process of elimination. You have 10
yeah,
companies. You
pretty
say
much.
8 of them are not good. Okay,
Mm,
let's make a bet on these other two, right? And
right.
you try to see how many companies you can see instead of 10. Can you see 100? And you say 98 are not good. Let's take a bet on the other two. Your odds of success are higher. So that's
Right.
that's basically how you look at
Yeah, you're hedging basically.
it.
So, before we move on to more of the investing side of things, do you want to talk about your work with Code for India?
Yeah, I mean, this was a not-for-profit where I was part of the founding team. This was, at this point, I think it was almost about 7 years ago, where we started off with the idea being to put together not-for-profits with engineers, where engineers donated pro bono time um, to help these not-for-profits build tech for them, etc. It worked out pretty well. I was associated with that for about 3 to 4 years. In the initial days, we scaled up pretty well. Had a lot of engineers from India and the US. We did a lot of work with Google, Facebook over there. It was an interesting journey. Saw lot into how much the engineers wanted to give back, which was a very interesting thing. I mean,
Nice.
in the startup landscape, engineers are definitely working 12, 13 hours a day, but on top of that, they were still willing to allocate time like this or over weekend, which was a very interesting and eye-opening experience. I haven't been involved with them for quite some time now, but I think the first 3, 4 years where we were working very aggressively on it, it was really interesting. I think they're still doing something new now at this point, but I'm not well aware.
Okay. Okay. So you haven't completely left behind computer science engineering, right? I mean, so part of what you do at 314 is also build software systems for your investment operations as such, right? To make it more efficient. Do you want to talk about that?
I mean, it came out of that traditional engineer laziness, right? Where you don't want to do too many things repetitively, right? So I realized that I was talking to 3 to 5 startups every day in the early days, and I just didn't want to go back and forth and do all the scheduling. So I wrote like a small command line app that would do the scheduling for me. Right. That's basically how it started off. But then eventually we ended up building a whole system to track all the companies, and the idea was, we had one centralized place where we were keeping a tab of this, which allowed us to have very quick turnaround time. So even though thousands of companies write to us every year, in an average time period of 2 to 3 days, we get back to all of them, right? And we never, even if it's a simple no, we make a point of just writing back to them and making sure we've communicated that. So a lot of that has been enabled largely because of the kind of tech we've put together. Now it's not just me; I have another couple of colleagues helping me out on this, but that's how it kind of started, and now we internally sort of use that a lot to optimize our operation. I mean, our investment team is at this point about 4 people, and we get 3 to 400 startups coming to us every month.
Wow.
So that's a big volume. So this kind of solution just helps us be optimal and get back to pretty much everyone that writes to us.
Interesting. Okay, let's talk about your investing thesis, right? I mean, broadly, it's around India being the next $10 trillion economy, right? So, a bunch of our markets are going to improve, our consumption is going to improve, infrastructure is going to improve, and we're going to grow, right? Obviously, there's only one way right now, which is up. So, you want to talk about how you're going to leverage this trend going forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are a few ways to look at it, right? And I think the India story has also been very well documented, so I'll not spend too much time, but there have been many companies, many solutions that have sort of focused at the bottom of the pyramid and seen great value, right? I mean, one of our companies, Money on Click, is a lending platform which is investing in the India 4 segment, right? Making people who live in tier 2 or beyond make 15 to 20,000 rupees a month. They're a lending platform for them and making a lot of money doing that, right? Without being a predatory lending platform or anything. So one is that how do you actually bring value to that segment of the society and uplift them while at the same time making money for yourself? And the second thing is, in the last 20, 30 years, the whole definition of Indian middle class has evolved. There is a big segment that is now well-to-do, has disposable income, and is willing to pay for meaningful services. So we've already seen some of that play out in education, for example, right? I mean, people don't mind paying through the roof for better educational services. We think similar things will happen in finance, similar things will happen in health also. So that's another theme that we are actively looking at in terms of better solutions for the consumer where you actually end up getting paid for it. And lastly, I think there is a very good, very emerging, and very strong enterprise and SaaS kind of a play coming out of India, which is building in India but for the world. And that's another thing that we have aggressively chased for a while, and we continue to look at. So it's a mixture of a few themes, but largely in terms of domains and stages, we remain agnostic. We're not really focusing on just consumer or just education or just health, anything like that. And anything in the early stages we are open to doing. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of our focus towards investment.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, either if you look at the supply side or the demand side, right? I mean, even if you look at the demand side, for example, even a portion of the 1.2 or 1.3 billion people that we have is huge, right? It's just absolutely huge. So even if you look at 75, 100 million people who are actively buying, stuff online or whatever, I mean, that's a huge base to sort of play in, right? And multiple people to be involved in. And then on the supply side, if you look at how this whole SaaS ecosystem has evolved, building from India for the world as such, there's potentially, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm being optimistic, but I think there are about 20 or 30 unicorns waiting to happen in that space going forward as well, right? Okay, you broadly touched upon fintech, edtech, and all of these various sectors. Any preferences, any of your favorites in that sense from a sector focused perspective?
No, look, I think fintech definitely has been a very interesting space, right? In the last 3 to 4 years, there's been not 3 to 4 years actually. In the last 6 to 8 years, there's been a lot of movement in fintech, a lot of growth, and the way we see it is that that kind of a consumer fintech play has expanded the scope of possibilities for other segments also. So I think it's only natural that once the financial problems are solved now, we are seeing more things being done on education, which is like another step in that hierarchy, and we'll very soon start seeing more interesting solutions in terms of health. So I think it's more of like an order of hierarchy and progressing down that path. That's kind of how we look at it. And I think we are sitting in a interesting position and in an interesting time where there is enough audience maturity, audience is willing to pay. So I think those kind of um, actual value delivering consumer technology is going to be a very, very interesting segment to look at in the next 3 to 5 years.
Right. Really sorry for the interruption. I'm just going to take a minute of your time to talk to you about something amazing. Move fast, break things. All of that is great advice for when you have nothing to lose. But once you have some base of users and customers, you cannot really afford to risk quality. So how do you still ship at lightning pace and delight your users and customers at the same time? Now that's where Bagasura comes in. Bagasura is a super easy way for people to give and take feedback about the product, and most importantly, close the loop. If you work in a design team, screenshots suck. But with Bagasura, you can actually get people to give you very contextual and accurate feedback about your UI and your UX. If you work in a QA team, 90% of your time goes in reproducing bugs. But with Bagasura, you can get people to reproduce bugs, document test cases, and resolve things all within Jira itself. Bagasura is being used by some of the leading design and QA teams around, and it's brought to you by the good folks at Mulya Testing, which is one of the best software and QA firms in the world. Do check out bagasura.io, that's BUGASURA.io, and sign up for a demo today. Ship fast and ship well. Right. So one of the things that I find interesting on the fintech side of things is how startups are going to become the way that banks or insurance companies will deliver services to their end customers, right? So in that sense, I mean, these guys might act as a regulatory box and have this whole API-fied kind of a structure, which startups and other third parties can leverage, right, and really serve the customer. So I think Andreessen Horowitz had this article by this lady, Angela Strange, who said that every company can potentially become a fintech company, right? And you're starting to see that with Paytm, for examples, and getting into insurance and things to that effect. Your opinion on this?
No, I think, look, it's a great place to be in, right? The moment I mean, if you think about businesses, they all exist for the purpose of making money, right? Everything else is a nice byproduct to have. So from that standpoint, having control over some financial aspect of that business is, in a sense, having control over that business. So it becomes a very valuable solution to the business if you're a fintech play. So I think definitely that those kind of financial technology companies will see a bit more of an explosive growth in the next decade, especially with nearly all sorts of transactions going online, right? If you think about it, uh, last decade was about bringing transactions online, 2020 to 2020. What would the next decade mean then? Just like new use cases exploding in terms of online
Value-added
transactions.
services and
Exactly. So from that standpoint, it's a great place to be in. Um, every fintech company can potentially become every company can potentially become a fintech company, but the question is, should every company become a fintech company? That's a different and a longer discussion, but I think there is that scope. I think we've only finished like phase one of fintech. There'll be many more to come, and that's where we sit and hope for some very brilliant entrepreneur to bring something like that our way.
Yeah. No, one thing that I particularly like is, 10 years back or, 15 years back, how fintech was being positioned as banks versus the startup kind of a thing, right? And there was this whole debate about, hey, will startups become banks soon, or banks become technology proficient soon, right? And that kind of has become redundant over the way, over the over the years, because banks have become a lot more proficient. I mean, it's amazing how fast they've adapted, and also, I mean, startups and these other guys have learned to play well with the banks, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, do you see that kind of cooperation getting deeper going forward, like that partnership between banks and startups as such?
No, definitely, and not just banks, but even other institutions. If you see, they're
Yeah,
becoming more and more open now.
yeah,
They are realizing that it's about how you look at it. Just because a company is in your space doesn't necessarily mean it's a competition, right? Some of these are complementary players, and if you see today, more than ever, more number of banks are working with startups. So I think that only goes forward, and I think that will create very interesting playing fields in the future. We are seeing banks acquire startups. There are cases where startups have gone and acquired banks also, right? It's worked out the both ways. So
right.
uh, I think it's just going to be more interesting permutations and combinations that come out with both parties working together, and that's definitely going to happen. And not just banks for that matter, right? There are lenders doing this, there are insurance companies doing
Insurance
this. So
companies, yeah,
let's not even limit to just one, right? I mean, there are
yeah,
massive card processing companies now aggressively working with startups to
right,
distribute their cards, right? So it's every aspect of fintech, and it's also the nature of financial products that they can be bundled together to create new products. It doesn't work similarly in other segments, right? I mean, um, it won't make sense for a Unilever to work with a paper boat and create a new product, right? But it
interesting,
does make sense for say a Mastercard to potentially work with a Neo and put out a new card product out there, right? That's the upside of a digital product. The potential possibilities do keep increasing. So I think we'll see more collaborations that way. Banks will open up even more now, especially Indian banks for Indian fintech startups.
right, right. Okay, moving on from fintech, I mean, we can do a whole section on fintech actually. Moving on from fintech, the other key sector focus for you is media and entertainment, right? And the way media has changed, I mean, over the last 10 years, one can arguably say that, it's probably been disrupted more than any other industry, right? Um, but let's talk about the business model, so we are seeing a shift from the old world advertising to the new world Substack kind of subscription sort of a model, right? So, uh, what are your thoughts on how the business model of media itself is evolving?
So I think there's a lot of changes coming, right? And if you see a Substack or a Medium, they still work on premium user generated content, right? That's their business model, and that's where subscription comes in, which is great in long form content to a certain extent, even in video content. I mean, video content is where we've seen Netflixes and Amazons thrive that way, right? But it's sort of a pick and choose kind of a play that you have to do, in the sense that when you go after subscription, you're not going after masses, right? Or TikTok goes after masses, runs off of ads and makes money, right? Subscription players limit their user base, but they make more money with fewer people, and both have continued to grow. I think what we've seen now is, if you have good enough content and relevant enough content, people do not hesitate to pay for it. So a Substack has good content, people are willing to pay. Another way to look at it is, an Unacademy or a Whitehead Junior has good content and people are willing to pay for it, right? So we are definitely seeing more capability to pay for high quality content, as long as there is a need for it. So then the question is, where does this need thing really apply? Clearly, educational content in one place, it does apply. Perhaps maybe health related content at some point, but what are the other spaces from a content standpoint that you can explore where subscriptions would make sense? And I think for everything else, you have to chase scale and hope for advertising revenue to make up for it, right? I mean, at some point, do you ever see yourself paying to watch some premium TikTok? Questionable,
Maybe.
right? It's snacky content, but it's hard to say. But if you have that need and if you fall in that segment, would you pay for Unacademy? Obviously you would. Why wouldn't you, right? So that's how we look at content. I think more vertical focused, very specific use case contents will continue to drive subscription, and others will go massy. And it's generally for VCs, it's like which particular domain do you want to build expertise in and chase in the longer run.
Right. So where does Pocket Aces fall in this axis of, let's say, useful and entertaining and interesting sort of a line?
So Pocket Aces is more of a media house play, right? I mean, they create their own content. They're not a TikTok or that kind of a model, right? They're a full-fledged content creation play, and I think what they are trying to, I mean, where they stand today is one big umbrella under which many massive content brands exist, which people can relate to. It's a brand play in that sense, right? It's a digital media brand. So a parallel would be like, if you think about it, Disney owns Marvel, or Disney owns Fox, etc. Right? It's a big content studio play. You wouldn't compare a Disney with a TikTok. Obviously, it would be it wouldn't make sense. So I think Pocket Aces is more along those lines. I think the explosion of web content has created a lot of sputter of individual content creators out there. But is there one big media house that is regularly churning out very interesting, very capturing kind of high quality content? That doesn't exist yet, and I think Pocket Aces fits there. And for that kind of content, everyone would be willing to pay, from advertisers, brand guys, to hopefully at some point even users, right, or distributors at the very least.
Right. So what we've seen over the last 5 years is that platforms are sort of arbitrary, right, in their decision making in some sense, and that's something that content creators always are begrudged about. Which is, let's say content gets flagged or demonetized, or the reach gets muted, and so on and so forth. So there is this sort of a trend, I think, maybe starting with Substack itself, of like owning your own distribution as such, right? So where do you see that going? I mean, do you see more of these media companies and so on, right, tomorrow saying that, hey, let me own my distribution as well. Let me have, let's say, a mailing list or whatever it is, maybe to begin with, or maybe build out a platform myself. I mean, do you see that happening, or do you see them just happily leveraging existing platforms itself?
No, I think it's a matter of the unbundling mechanism, how it's played out, right? And that is where it's hard to say how it's going to play out in media. So, for example, if you look at it, the same unbundling has played out in commerce before, right? Where instead of everyone selling it on Amazon, they decided to build their own Shopify platform where they sold directly, right? But the growth there is predictable in the sense that that's a very transactional platform, right? Where every good you sell, you make money, right? Unfortunately, in media, that's not how it works, right? Because media has a very different dynamic. You first go out, you first get tremendous amount of views and exposure and followers for which you don't get paid at all. It's just a lot of hard work. And eventually, when you have that kind of spotlight on you, everyone from other content creators to brands, everyone's willing to pay you money so that you work with them, right? And that is where I think these aggregators have a slightly higher upper hand, um, because they bring so much traffic that they can make stars out of you, right? And when I say aggregators, everything from a Netflix, Amazon to talent management agencies or film studios or whatever you want to call, right? I mean, you can launch your own YouTube channel, and in most cases you can become like a Bhuvan Bham or something, right? Become very famous. But still, when a Yash Raj launches a Ranveer Singh, he's Ranveer Singh, right? He doesn't need YouTube. He's that big. So that still exists. So the question is, if you're unbundling this, building your own platforms on your own, how much of that growth can you achieve? I'm not saying you can't achieve, but I think that's still unanswered. How does that discovery even work out, right? If you're a small time creator, how much can you potentially get paid? Could you really become a millionaire off of your Medium or a Substack? Probably a handful can, but maybe not as many. And those people will have to, uh, at some point, I mean, people who are writing on Substack also will write on other aggregators like Washington Post or a New York Times, and then they'll build the brand and say, okay, now please subscribe to my Substack, right? So you may not be fully able to avoid those kind of players. So I think both will have to work together, just because media and celebrity work slightly differently from, say, an e-commerce model.
I think it's a very interesting point. That's a very interesting point. I think recently, I mean, there were a couple of New York Times reporters who quit to start their own Substack as such. So we might actually be at the throes of that, wherein a bunch of these guys just quit and start their own Substack, and
But see, they have that brand value, right? So, for example,
exactly.
when Will Smith starts his YouTube channel, obviously people come because he's Will Smith. If I start my YouTube channel, I'm kind of screwed.
Right. Okay. The other thing that we are both extremely optimistic about is the whole SaaS space, right? Building from India to the world. How do you think we can build the next Salesforce of Salesforce of tomorrow?
I mean, honestly, I think there are many companies today on that sales front itself doing many interesting things, right? What you have to understand is also SaaS is a tough space in the sense that it takes a 4 to 5 year window to see some kind of success, right? It's just it takes 2 years to get to a product market fit, another year to get to $1 million revenue, 3 to 4 years to get to like 10-15 million dollars kind of a revenue, right? So that's an extended timeline. So I think we should have more of a stance of encouraging more of these SaaS startups to iterate product, go global, grow more aggressively, rather than on day one putting a pressure on them saying please become the next Salesforce. It's still early, but I think we're fairly optimistic. I mean, look, Freshworks is doing incredibly well, right? It took 9 years to get there, but that's okay, right? Still, an export like this from India is a very, very big deal. Similarly, in the next few years, more will come. I think in the next 5 years, we'll see very, very big players dominate. From our side, Darwinbox has been growing phenomenally well already, looking outside India, Open similarly. So I think these platforms will just continue to grow. We just have to give them the time to breathe and find their way and scale up. But I'm fairly optimistic that in time there will be enough of such companies, if not bigger companies.
Right. And from an investor perspective itself, it must be exciting for you to look at some of these unit economics, or I mean uh, the fact that it's compounding revenue and stuff like that, right? I mean, those must be really exciting from your perspective.
Oh yeah, there is nothing like growth plus revenue at the same time, right? It's the
Yeah.
it's the holy grail that we all try to chase. And I think
Yeah.
SaaS is a great example. I mean, you're running at
Yeah.
80-85% gross margin.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant business that way. Very limited number of people needed and extreme scale possible. So
Yeah.
from that standpoint, from a just a P&L standpoint, it's definitely one of the more lucrative businesses to invest in. But at the same time, it's not that easy. SaaS is hard, right? I think
Mm.
it's often underrated how difficult SaaS is. And
Mm.
uh, while people are more focused on SaaS today, I hope few failures don't discourage them also.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that absolutely blew my mind is this concept of negative churn, right? So when I saw churn at 150%, and then finally, I got to understand what that means. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
So uh, why don't you call out those challenges a little more? I mean, what do you see as specific challenges in growing a SaaS business today, right? Out of India, let's say.
I mean, look, the technology expertise, the know-how is still something that's emerging, right?
Hmm.
And when you're building from India to the world, you also have to understand that you're disconnected from the customer, right? I mean, there is a distance that
Yeah.
comes in between. You're building for someone who's 12 hours away from you on a time zone, right?
Hmm.
And you're building for a very specific use case. A SaaS company doesn't start off by building everything from everyone. You have to understand a very specific use case. You have to have good insight and solve,
Yeah.
while at the same time communicating with someone who's in the diametrically opposite time zone, right? Just getting the product right in itself is a very, very challenging thing.
Yeah.
And SaaS, I mean, a lot of SaaS growth also happens via inbound growth, right? You do marketing, you do product marketing, and generate inbound leads for yourself. Any product you build, just through campaigns and that kind of content, explaining everything about your product, if it's a new product in a new category, it's not easy.
Hmm.
And it's only when you actually sit down and put pen to the paper that you start realizing how tough a challenge that is, right?
Yeah.
Communicating something very simply, very clearly to an audience that doesn't hasn't seen a product like this before is tough. And I think in the first 2-3 years, that is where a lot of iteration happens. That is where a lot of discovery happens. And that requires a certain expertise. I think it's an emerging expertise in this country, thanks to a lot of big SaaS companies that have done very well. But we
Hmm.
need to, we need to still realize that it's limited and it's boxed, and we need to make sure that there is there is that leeway we give them. There is that, and we need to be understanding about how tough that particular challenge is.
Yeah. No, I think you're on point when you say that, because one of the things that I've realized working in a SaaS company over the last 3+ years is the fact that, your product market fit itself is a continuous journey. Every market that you expand to, every new use case that you discover, you have to go through that journey, both from a product, marketing, sales, whatever other function side of things, right? So it's definitely not as trivial as saying, hey, I mean, put a bunch of engineers together and then build for the world. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the
It looks good on
principles,
paper, but reality is tough.
like with pretty much everything, right? Everything that looks good on paper is almost inversely proportional to how easy it is.
Yeah.
So one of the principles that you guys also follow is responsible investing, right? Or capitalism for good.
Mhm.
Solving the really large problems of the world, right? Whether that's poverty or hunger, or some function of that, like financial inclusion or something like that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? How important it is for you as a person and for the firm?
Yeah, I mean, look, it is a, like, India is a market, and India extended to India plus Southeast Asia also, right? It is one of those spaces where, uh, as a demography, there is a lot of upliftment happening, right? And if or it's not too difficult as a company, as an investment firm, to just make sure that your practices are participatory to that rather than going against that, right? It's not too much of a challenge. I mean, um, if you have a lower strata of society, right, um, which is in dire need of finances at all times, payday loan is a perfectly fine solution for that, right? I mean, predatory loans like 30-40% interest rate, but it's also to a certain extent exploitative, right? I don't want to say exploitative per se, but it's a bit aggressive, right? At the same time, you could also think about a different kind of a say loan product, which is a longer tenure loan with somewhat limited interest rate that actually helps them come out of this problem rather than be back in debt by the time they've repaid this particular loan. So you can structure things slightly differently, and you can still make money out of it, right? I mean, doing social good doesn't necessarily mean be loss making. So I think it's just about being a bit more open towards some of these kind of business models, and um, we as a fund are actually PRI compliant, right? So I think we might be one of the first funds out of India to be PRI compliant, but in every one of our investments, we've actually shown that we have that responsible investment compliance that we've done. So we intend to continue to do that. We intend to continue to stick to that. And I think despite keeping that as a lens and as a filter, there are a lot of opportunities out there. And it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah. No, again, you're on point. I mean, India is such a big place, and so many really, really basic problems that require solving, that there's whole markets for the taking, right, on that front. So before I let you go, I have to ask you about books or podcasts that you would recommend.
So books or podcasts. In terms of podcasts, I really like Acquired. It's a great podcast. It picks a company per episode, 90 to 120 minutes. Talks about their journey from incorporation to exit. So either an acquisition or IPO listing or whatever. That's a great podcast. I think in terms of books, there are quite a lot. I mean, I could go on, but few that come to mind. Power of Habit is an all-time favorite. It's. I mean, if you haven't heard about it, it's a book that talks about how you can actually go ahead and control every habit that you have and tweak it at your will, and it's not that difficult. Another great book I've read is a book called Thinking in Bets, which is making decisions when you simply don't have the entire information, right? How do you go about making it, which is what a lot of early stage investing is all about. So that's another very, very interesting book that I keep recommending. Another one that often comes to mind is a book called Eating the Big Fish, which is if you're a new player in any space, how do you sort of build your brand when there are many, many massively big players that already exist. So it's a great marketing handbook to always have by your side.
Fine. Interesting, really interesting. And hey, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much again, Anurag. Plenty of things that I learned myself, and I'm sure people who are listening to this will learn as well. So where can people find you on social media? What do you have coming up? You want to talk about that briefly?
No, I mean, few more investments that we've recently done. Hopefully, we should be announcing them soon.
Right.
I'm always reachable on Twitter at Anurag Hu. LinkedIn, again, two places where I'm relatively more active than anywhere else. But
Right.
yeah, and anyone can at any point drop me a mail directly also. I always reply to all of them.
Fantastic. Hey, thanks so much, man. This was real fun. Thank you so much.
Cool, man. Awesome.
Yeah, thanks
I
so
hope
much.
you got everything that you wanted.
Yeah, this was really nice. Really nice. I think we did a little more than 45 minutes. So
Yeah.
good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you so much.
Cool, man. All right, sure. Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening. This was Anurag of 314 Capital. This was a fantastic chat that we had on early stage investing, a bunch of sectors he's interested in, like fintech and media and so on. Hope you like this podcast. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. We are the Startup Operator. We're actually Operator Startup on Twitter. Anyway, keep the feedback coming in. Hope to put out more good content shortly. See you. Bye.